Hi, I'm Jenna Sachs. I'm here with Brian Polson on election night here in the FOX6 Digital Center, and this is where we will be streaming live results as they come in tonight. We're going to have some analysis from experts we're bringing in, and we'll be talking to our fields live in the crews, live in the field who are with the candidates at their election night party. So it's a very big night for us.
We're getting ready to talk for 2 solid hours is what we're really trying to say here, because there's obviously a lot to talk about. There's so much at stake in this election. I feel like we say that every time, especially in November, but this is obviously one where the balance of power in both Congress for the United States and here in the state of Wisconsin, the legislature, are at stake. Of course, we'll find out who's going to be in the governor's office, whether will it be incumbent Tony Evers or his challenger, Tim Michels. Got that big U.S. Senate race. There's referendums all over the state, so there's really a lot going on tonight, and the polls are going to be closing in a little less than an hour.
And talk about how important these races are. We've seen hundreds of millions of dollars being spent in campaign ads and text messages and mailers. I don't know about you. I'm excited not to have so many text messages.
We're all excited
to my
stop
phone.
getting the text messages, absolutely.
Right, and we've already seen hundreds of thousands of absentee ballots coming in, and we've heard from people who have been in lines for a long period of time today. So it seems that we're going to have some decent turnout today, and people are invested in some of these races that will determine the balance of power, not only in our state, but also could do on the national level as well. But we should take a look around and show you what we're working in tonight. This is our FOX6 Digital Center. Can we take that wide shot and show everybody?
Say hi to photographer Jeff Frings and executive producer Sarah Smith, working hard behind the scenes to make all of this happen. I think, can we see Anthony Mandela?
Is Anthony Mandela?
Well?
He's trying to.
Yeah, we can see him too.
He was hoping we couldn't.
View.
But we show you this to show you we have a whole team of people monitoring the numbers that are coming in tonight and what we're hearing. The moment we have it, this is a less formal setting where we're just going to kind of go with it and report the numbers as they come in. But like you mentioned before, some very important races tonight.
Well, and I do want to point one thing out. As you watch us and hear the analysis and the experts and our crews in the field, when results start coming in, they will be, there's some really great charts and graphics at fox6now.com. If you go there and you click on any of the election stories right now, the results aren't there yet, but you'll see there's a balance of power map, both for the United States Congress and, of course, for the state legislature. And you can watch, that's going to change throughout the night as we see which parties are winning how many seats and where that goes. Obviously, both are looking to maintain or gain control in ways that could affect all of us for years to come.
And maybe we could start by talking a bit about some of the biggest races of the night, because we have a governor's race obviously going on in this state right now, and it is razor thin. Statistically, we have a tie, if you believe the polls that we've been given so far. We have incumbent Tony Evers versus Tim Michels. Tony Evers obviously running for re-election after 4 years. And this has been a really expensive race. I think $115 million.
Most expensive in state history.
Right. And that was just last week, that 115 million number. So think of everything that's been poured into this race in the last week alone. And that beat out the last election, which was it 2018, 98 million.
Well, and I think
so
about that
more.
2018, because Jenna, that was the first time I think we did this digital setup where we started carrying these things on our digital platforms as well as on the air. And that was a long night. Scott Walker, of course, running for re-election against Tony Evers. And Tony Evers pulled out sort of that late night victory as results were coming into the city of Milwaukee into the wee hours. It was a long night, a dramatic night. But that was one of those years we started talking about the razor thin margins. And every time we sit down here since, statewide, these are razor thin races. The state of Wisconsin has become about as purple as they come, and these races are always tight.
And think of how many of our races have been decided by 1 percentage point or less than 1 percentage point. So when these polls show that the numbers are about even for a number of these races or within the margin of error, we really don't know what that means. Now, it seems like Republicans have some momentum going into this election night. We know that a sitting president's party tends to lose during midterm elections. We know that there was a poll done that showed a number of people in the state, more than 50%, think it's headed in the wrong direction. And there are a number of races tonight that could go either way. We're going to be monitoring them pretty closely.
I know we've been, obviously there are pollsters and pundits who have all sorts of ideas of how this is going to go, but we won't know until those results come in what this is going to look like. As you mentioned, midterm elections often are good for the party that lost the last presidential election. That would seem to mean this would be a good night for Republicans, but then we had something happen, obviously pretty dramatic in the interim, which was the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade, which may well have gained the level of enthusiasm on the opposing side of the aisle. So there's a lot of questions, I think, coming into tonight, and we're going to see them play out in just the next few hours.
And we know what issues matter to voters. We know inflation is a top concern of many voters. We know public schools, crime, gun violence. You mentioned abortion, also accurate vote count. These are all issues that have been identified, and different parties report different concerns. So the GOP candidate and their party tend to say accurate vote count is most important, inflation, crime, illegal immigration. If you're on the Democratic side, you might say abortion, gun violence, public schools, accurate vote count for different reasons. And whoever wins the governor's office will have a lot of power in terms, unless the supermajority plays in terms of deciding what happens with those major issues, because we know Tony Evers has vetoed a number of those measures so far, and we're going to talk later, I'm sure, about whether or not he's going to have that power.
Well, and I think that term supermajority is something you're going to hear us talk about a lot tonight. Republicans in the state Senate and state Assembly are trying to achieve 2/3 majority in each of those houses. If they do that, then Governor Evers, whether he wins or loses, that veto pen won't be a concern because they could override any veto. So on the one hand, Republicans are trying to win the supermajority, and of course, more importantly, they are trying to win the governor's race, because then the supermajority becomes sort of a moot point. We'll talk more about a lot of that later on. We're going to be going out to some of our crews in the field shortly, but before we do, we want to start with a piece that Jason Calvi, our political reporter, put together about this governor's race and the final push for votes here right before Election Day.
How's it going today? Governor Tony Evers lays out his lesson plan for Wisconsin. The state tour kicks off in Milwaukee.
We're going to win this, but we're going to need everybody doing everything you can.
As national reinforcements come in to help both candidates win Wisconsin.
Hello, Milwaukee.
U.S. Labor Secretary Marty Walsh with Evers rallies union members to vote blue.
We're not going to be knocked down this time. We're going to get up. We're going to send a message. You're going to send the governor back to the State House.
While Republican challenger Tim Michels rallies with Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, who flipped that state red.
Now's your moment. It's your moment. It's your moment to pick up that red wave that's crossing across the whole nation.
On Wednesday, Michels stopped in Waukesha, a crucial red county with slipping Republican support. In 2014, Scott Walker won 72% of the county, dropping in 2018 to 66%. Donald Trump underperformed those numbers here in both 2016 and 2020. He won roughly 60% of Waukesha County. And statewide, Evers beat Walker in 2018 by 1.1%.
We have a really strong economy, folks. We are in the best shape we've been in a decade. We have one of the lowest unemployment rates ever, and we've got the most people working ever.
This year, polls show the economy is a top issue.
I'm not some candidate just standing up here talking about creating jobs.
Can you turn the volume down a little?
Created thousands of jobs.
Now you decide who should be governor.
Go right away. Okay. So obviously that sets the scene for today and the results we're going to hear tonight. And we have reporters who are at the watch parties, I guess, for each of these candidates, incumbent Governor Tony Evers and, of course, challenger Tim Michels. And we're going to go first to Cassidy Williams, who is with the Governor Evers camp. Cassidy, tell us what you're seeing out there early on and what you expect to see as the night goes on.
Well, doors haven't opened up quite yet at the Evers campaign. We're at the Orpheum Theater. This is the same spot Evers was when he won in 2018. He's hoping to once again give an acceptance speech up on that stage. For now, it's just the media here. We'll give you a look. Media from really all across the state here to see if Evers will win re-election. I actually just spoke with a senior advisor with the campaign about what they've been hearing. They said turnout they believe has been good in both Madison and Milwaukee, which they believe is a good thing for Democrats. Also, some things they've seen from early voting. They've seen a 300% increase when it comes to young voters, and they believe those young voters is a good sign for Democrats as well. So Evers has been saying for the past week or so, every time he's asked, that he believes he's going to win tonight, but he knows it's going to be a late one. We'll be here until a result comes out.
Now, Cassidy, the governor has spoken about being kind of a check on the Republicans who control the rest of the legislature in Wisconsin, kind of being that goalie, if you use the sports reference. Has anyone you've spoken with on the governor's team talked about the importance of them keeping his office tonight?
Well, when we spoke to Evers earlier today, when he voted with his wife around 11 in the Madison area, he talked about how even though, Wisconsin is a very purple state, Michaels called it last night, the purplest of the purple. Evers was saying that he wishes the state was less gerrymandered, that he's been calling out that he's struggled to work with the Republican-led legislature. So he did talk about how he wants to be there, and he's vetoed. He's in one legislative session set the record for the amount of vetoes. So that is very much being talked about.
You said doors haven't opened there yet. When do you expect doors to open where they start letting people into the party?
Doors will open at 8, and I asked them how late do they have this building, and I was just told very late. They have it as long as they need it.
Could be a long night ahead for you, Cassidy. Thank you so much, obviously, with photojournalist Sean Chen. Thanks a lot. We'll be checking in with you, I'm sure, throughout the night. Yeah, it could be a long night ahead, obviously. I did hear, and we're going to be hearing from Ashley Sears a little later on at Central Count, there was some discussion that they may be hoping to have results in Milwaukee tonight by as early as 10 or 10:30. If that's the case, it would be a lot earlier than 2018. We know they started counting absentee ballots today as soon as the polls opened. So they've been counting those throughout the day, and it's a record number of absentee ballots to count. But that at least means they've gotten that sort of head start, and I was just talking to Fox 6's Ted Perry about this. I don't know when they started doing it that way, because my recollection was always they waited until polls closed to start counting absentee ballots.
Now
but
they do it
by doing it at the
morning.
beginning of the day, obviously there's a chance they'll get done earlier. Milwaukee often being one of the later arrivals to come in terms of votes. If they're done earlier, we may know who's going to win this governor's race one way or the other within a few hours. But obviously we'll find that out. Maybe I'm wrong and we'll be here at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning telling you we still don't know a thing. But there's an awful lot of votes to count.
Absolutely. And Cassidy, I think, mentioned something really important when she talked about Tony Evers executing his veto power. She mentioned that statistic of more than 120 vetoes in the last legislative session, which was 2 years. Those were vetoes on issues like gun control, on abortion, on schools. These are high priority issues for a number of voters. And he is that person that is standing in the way of the Republican agenda, or if you're a Democrat, he is your defender against the Republican agenda. So I think talking about the veto pen is a really important thing that she brought up.
And that's why we know that Republicans have a couple of avenues for trying to get around that blockade, so to speak, and that is either winning the supermajority or winning the governor's office. One way or the other, their agenda would certainly take off at that point. We have Gabrielle Mays, who is on the other side. She is at the Tim Michaels camp tonight, and she is there, I believe, with photojournalist Tanner Hemker as they're getting set for things. What are you seeing? What's the early setting look like there, Gabby?
I hope you guys can see me because I can't really see the screen.
We can.
We can see you.
So, okay, you can see me. Okay, good. I couldn't see myself, so I got a little nervous. Anyway, so the Michaels campaign, doors have opened. So people are kind of trickling in right now. Not a huge crowd just yet, but they were saying it's going to take a little bit of time. So this is going to be a very interesting election. Now, when we talked to when we talked to Michaels earlier today, it was very interesting. He seems very confident. And, he's kind of talking about what he's going to do the first days in office. And I'm thinking, okay, he's very confident in regards to him wanting to be Wisconsin's next governor. So now it's really up to the voters to decide. Of course, everyone here is hoping for a Michaels win, but we'll just have to see.
How do they feel about the momentum right now? I know nationwide they've been saying they think Republicans have some momentum in their favor right now. Are you getting that impression that the Michaels campaign feels that way too?
I do think that they have that sense of feeling. I will tell you, it's something that's been really interesting with the Michaels campaign. They really have not talked to the media a lot. I mean, you really have to go out and seek to find them. We did ask if any of them were going to talk to us, and they basically said no. So then it's left up to talking to those who are here as supporters of them. But if you look at pretty much the trend, I mean, you can tell that there is a lot of momentum for a Republican to take office. Whether that happens, of course, we know it's always up to the voters.
Gabby, I have to ask you a really important question, which is when you're in the newsroom on election night, there's pizza. When you're not, I think you get a box lunch. Did you get your box lunch? That's my question for you.
That's a good question. And yes, I did get my box lunch. It was a sandwich. It was very nice. Pizza's nice because it's nice and warm, right? But the sandwich is probably healthier anyway. So I did eat half the sandwich. The other half I'll probably eat a little bit later.
Well, save it up. You're going to need your energy tonight.
Before you go, could you paint a picture for us of what the media presence is like there tonight?
Oh,
Is
sure,
there
yeah. And I
media
mean,
from
like,
all over the state? Is
I don't
it
know how
people
to
from?
turn this around, but like, yeah, I mean, pretty much if you look behind me, because it's kind of hard for me to see, but there's pretty much outlets from all across the states. You've got your Madison, you've got your Wausau, you've also got the networks here as well. So I saw some of the other networks and the correspondents here. So there's a lot of people here. Right now, there's more members of the media than there are Michael's supporters, but I'm sure that's going to change within the next hour or so. It's still going to take some time for people to trickle in.
That's certainly going to change before the night is out. Gabby, thank you so much for joining us. Good luck with all your coverage tonight.
Thanks, guys.
You know, we have not talked about this yet tonight, but when we're here in a primary season, we often talk about, look, what is it that differentiates these candidates maybe on the Republican side or on the Democratic side? And within that party, sometimes it's hard to find the points of differentiation. It is not hard to find the differences between Tony Evers and Tim Michels. There's a very stark contrast for voters, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there's been a lot made of the topic of abortion, right? We have candidates on completely different sides. When you talk about violence, they take very different positions as well. And we should also mention that whoever is elected will be the governor during the next presidential election and will have power to certify the results and power to maybe shape how that election takes place, which is a priority of Republicans, something that's been thwarted so far by the governor's veto pen. So that is something very important. And that's partly why the national outlets she mentioned are there, because they're interested in who's in control of the states heading into that next presidential election and the impacts that can have nationwide. Because you think we're just voting on some local offices and state offices. No, these have big impacts, and we know that the impacts of the decisions tonight are going to follow through in this state and beyond.
Yeah, governor's races are obviously one thing, but when you talk about U.S. Senate, which we know we have, I don't know if we've talked much about the candidates yet, but of course we have incumbent Senator Ron Johnson facing a challenger, Mandela Barnes, and those two obviously are part of this push for the balance of power in the United States Senate. Republicans need to pick up one seat there. Democrats, if they pick up one seat, it's a 50-50 split right now. So obviously it's a razor-thin margin there. This
with Kamala Harris as that tie-breaking vote.
So Republicans would love to pick up that one seat to get that control, or more if they could. This is one of those races that people have been watching for a long time. It seems to be sort of leaning more toward Ron Johnson holding on to that seat, but of course you never know until the votes are counted. We have Aaron Maben, who put together a piece to give us a little bit of a preview of this race.
On battling bus tours,
what do you think of the Ronmobile?
incumbent Republican Senator Ron Johnson and his Democratic challenger, Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes,
all gas, no brakes for the next 35 hours or so,
making a last-minute push before the midterm election. Monday morning, Barnes talked with canvassers before making stops in Green Bay and Madison.
I can guarantee you we have not been outworked. We're leaving no stone unturned.
With the help of former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, Senator Johnson talked with supporters in Waukesha Monday afternoon.
You want him representing you? I kind of knew that answer.
The two sharing different stances on the economy, abortion, energy, and more. The campaign attacks sharpening as things come down to the wire.
There's a candidate, myself, who's going to look out for working people. And there's the incumbent who's only looked out for himself for the last 12 years.
He's never had, as far as I can tell, a real job in the private sector. I know his mom was a teacher. I know his dad worked third shift. By the way, I worked all shifts for about 5 or 6 years.
The candidates urging people to vote Tuesday, both mentioning freedom in their final pitches.
This is for our future. It's a fight for freedom. It's a fight for fairness as well. Ron Johnson's on the wrong side of that equation.
This is a fight for freedom. It's not somebody else's fight. This is our fight, and it is a fight that we absolutely must win.
Obviously, this is a race that has grown really intense and a lot more negative in recent days. In particular, there have been discussions of racial overtones to some of the advertising. Obviously, there's a lot on the line with this, as we talked about before. And again, a stark contrast between the two candidates, right?
Right. And we should mention, as we did before, the Marquette poll showed them pretty much neck and neck. Johnson was ahead by 2 percentage points, which is within the margin of error. But Ron Johnson has a history of outperforming his polls. So we'll see if that's the case again tonight. But two very different candidates. And you're right, so much money being spent on this race. I'm sure you've seen these ads, gotten these mailers as well. Something like the 4th most expensive Senate race this cycle with $177 million spent, and I'm sure
And we've heard
those
the
of you at
results
home
of that,
have
right?
felt
Because
that.
you keep hearing the ads, getting the text messages, and so on and so forth.
And I mean, very different candidates. Obviously, we're in this battleground state where people are on different sides of the aisle, but very different candidates. Ron Johnson traditionally has been a bit of a lightning rod nationwide. He said some things about the federal government's role with COVID-19, vaccinations, January 6th, that have gotten attention, but they have very different platforms. We know that Ron Johnson also cares about border security, human trafficking, cybersecurity issues, overpayment in the Medicare system. And he is running for his third term. Even though he said earlier he would not be running for that third term, he said he felt that the stakes were too high and he had to do that. Now, on the other hand, we have this young candidate, Mandela Barnes, 35 years old, half the age of the average senator. He could be our first black senator from Wisconsin, so history could be made tonight. But right now, we'll see if those polls are showing who is ahead, but very different when it comes to issues like crime prevention, abortion, election integrity. So again, you have a wide range of opposition here.
You know, you talked about how the Marquette poll shows this still being a very tight race. And I have a tough time sometimes knowing what polls to trust and which ones not to and at what time. If you look at some of the pundits, 538 is one, for example. They aren't even considering this one to be a close race anymore. They've given it to Ron Johnson. Yet the numbers from the Marquette poll show it being very close. And I feel like a lot of times we have ideas what the pundits think going in, and then we find out something altogether different. 538 is the one who said that Hillary Clinton was going to trounce Donald Trump, and obviously we saw what happened there. So you wait till the votes are counted. When it comes to this race, we've got a couple of reporters in the field for this one. I know we're going to be going to Sam Kramer, who's with Sam Godet at the Ron Johnson headquarters. Is that right, Sam? Do we have you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can. Tell us what's going on out there.
All right. So if it sounds like there's a little buzz in the ballroom, that's because there is. We just got word that sometime soon, some of his supporters that are gathered here, organizers said they expect as many as 400 people here tonight. Again, we're up in Neenah at the Best Western Hotel, Premier Hotel, and it is. I had a chance to talk with people over the last hour or so, and confidence seems high. You mentioned the polls. There's this belief, at least among Republican supporters here, that Republicans are generally kind of undersold in the polls, meaning that, the true support that they have for a candidate is higher than the poll would let it perceive to be. I had the chance to chat with about 5 different supporters, various levels as far as what they do, their involvement, and that sort of thing. But there's a strong confidence here tonight, based on the fact that they believe a lot of strong turnout today. They believe is going to help Republicans because it comes back to kind of what's happened since 2020. If you look at the state capitol, if you look at the White House, even frustration with inflation and prices, frustration with crime and safety. And so they think that is why so many people are making it out tonight and taking part in this.
Sam, it's interesting. This is the first time Johnson has gone against an opponent who isn't Russ Feingold, actually. What does he make of this particular opponent and how he would fare as a senator?
He doesn't believe Mandela Barnes would be a good fit for Wisconsin, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One, as he's pointed out numerous times, Mandela Barnes doesn't have much when it comes to private sector experience, unlike the senator who, of course, as we know, founded a plastics manufacturing company. And 2, he just believes that Mandela Barnes is too far, obviously, the other way in his regard. So, he understands that he's the old person in the room when it comes to this race, but he believes that experience isn't for nothing, so to speak.
Do you get any sense in terms of name recognition? Ron Johnson obviously is a 2-term senator now. Mandela Barnes, while he is lieutenant governor, that's not exactly the highest profile of statewide positions. Often, obviously, it's overshadowed by the governor. Do you get a sense that in the Milwaukee area, certainly well known, but throughout the state, is name recognition at all an issue? Now, obviously, there's been a lot of ad spending to try to take care of that, but does that seem to have come into play at all in this race?
I don't know, because everyone that I've talked to tonight has a good idea of who Mandela Barnes is. And at least what they've been, led to believe based on television, radio, you name it, ads. So, you brought up, if they didn't know about him before, they certainly know about him now. But yeah, I mean, I think, Ron Johnson, he touts this bus tour that he just took 10 days, 60 stops, 3,000 miles. And, Mandela Barnes, to his credit, another aggressive ground game, but Republicans just seem to do better in the rural areas of the states. And, tonight they're hoping that they'll get more voters elsewhere to push Johnson across the finish line.
All right, Sam Kramer, you've got a long night ahead as well. I'm sure we'll be checking back in with you. Thanks a lot for this, for that update.
It sounds like we're ready to go to Aaron Mabin, who I assume is with Mandela Barnes in Milwaukee tonight.
I think we're going to hear a little different story there. Aaron, what can you tell us from the Mandela Barnes camp?
Hey, Jenna and Brian, wouldn't be election night if I wasn't talking to you two, so good to be with you all tonight. We're here inside the Turner Hall Ballroom, and just in a few minutes at 7:30, we are going to have the doors over my shoulder open, and they will be some of the first supporters for the Lieutenant Governor coming to support him here. This is a space for concerts, for shows, but the show tonight is going to be the showdown between Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes and Senator Ron Johnson, too. Now, I was able to talk to the campaign communications director for Mandela Barnes. I said, what has his day been like? He had an event at 6 o'clock this morning. He then went to something at 8, then something at 11 to talk to canvassers. Then from there, he went to different coffee shops. He went around Milwaukee. He went to the Sherman Phoenix, which is on Milwaukee's north side, where he launched his campaign. His goal today is to really fire up supporters, to talk to voters, and he's telling them, make sure you tell your cousin, your family members, your neighbors to get out and vote too. He understands the power of the Milwaukee vote. He also understands the power of the young vote. He interviews at University of Wisconsin Green Bay, where he talked to supporters there. He talked to some students, and then he went over to Madison for another event. He knows that he's the underdog, but he says that every election, every race that he's been in, Jenna and Brian, that he's always been the underdog, and he really is relying on his supporters, and they believe that he can pull out a victory today.
That's interesting you mentioned that underdog status, because he is really someone who is taking on the incumbent, right? During a difficult year for Democrats, traditionally, historically, when the president is a Democrat, the midterms don't tend to go well for them, and vice versa. Do you feel like he is making any headway outside of Milwaukee, where he's best known?
That's a good question. It's really interesting because later in late last week, we were kind of wondering, why isn't he focusing in Milwaukee? I believe he was up in the Ashland area in northwestern Wisconsin. He went into other pockets of the state that are typically red. And it seems like his campaign would say that he did make some headway there, but who knows if that's going to be enough. But on his bus tour, he really did canvass the entire state, but really focusing on the southeastern part of the state. Dane County, Waukesha, Ozaukee, also Milwaukee County, Racine and Kenosha in these later days too.
Aaron, it strikes me that just a few months ago, we had you on here and you were at the headquarters of the first black mayor, Cavalier Johnson in the city of Milwaukee. Should Mandela Barnes pull this out, and although maybe numbers more recently have swayed more toward Ron Johnson, should he become the first black U.S. senator from the state of Wisconsin? Can you talk about sort of the discussion there and the feelings there about setting that kind of history?
Yeah, if he gets elected, he would be the first black senator from the state of Wisconsin representing the state of Wisconsin. And they understand, the voters he talked with understand the power of that. But, I didn't really hear that too much on the campaign trail. It didn't seem like he mentioned the history too much unless it was brought up to him. But you kind of think, who did he bring in to speak with him? President Barack Obama, the first black president of the United States. He joined him on the campaign trail too. They were at a local high school in this area. Gwen Moore has been a big supporter of him. She is certainly someone who knows how to bring African Americans to the poll. And just a few days ago, Senator Cory Booker, the black senator from New Jersey, the first black senator from New Jersey. And he talked about this history, Cory Booker did, saying that he was the first black senator elected since Reconstruction. So while he may not talk about it a lot, these big hitters, these last-minute big hitters who have come in, they are talking about it as well. They certainly understand the history of tonight.
And Aaron, before you go, I know you got a lot to do tonight. Can we take a look around that room? I'm interested in seeing the crowd and the media that's gathered.
Okay, I don't know how to flip the camera around, so stay with me here.
Just turn it, yeah.
Okay, so it's quite amazing. This is There's someone from the Washington Post. We have all of our local stations here in Milwaukee, someone from CNN, FOX News as well. So this is just the media here, reporters, photographers, other journalists as well, and the members of the Mandela Barnes campaign, they're in here as well. And this is actually the communications team taking a photo at the stage. What a trip that they've had from the beginning. They've answered all of our questions and gave us some interviews today. So just a few minutes, we'll be joined by a lot more other people.
Well, thank you so much, Aaron. It's always nice talking to you on election
good
night.
To see you both.
And I believe we have another reporter in the field. Do we have Ashley at Central Count? Is that who we're going to next?
Okay, yeah.
Oh, that looks
right
different
away.
than normal. Ashley, are you at a new location this time around?
Yeah, we are at Milwaukee's Central Count location. The new location is the Wisconsin Center District. This is where all of Milwaukee's absentee ballots are being counted. That's more than 60,000, making this one of the busiest locations on election night. About 250 election workers are in this room. They are reviewing envelopes to make sure they meet requirements, and ballots are tabulated by ward. Counting began here at 7 o'clock this morning. The Milwaukee Election Commission Executive Director says the amount of absentee ballots is about the same as the general election in 2016. She tells us things have been going smoothly at polling places across the city as well as here. And she says about 70 to 75% of registered voters turned out for this election. Now, this is open to the public. Observers from the major parties are here tonight in this room, and things are expected to wrap here around 10 or 11 o'clock tonight.
Actually, we like to pretend sometimes that we know it all here, and I don't always know the answers to these things. So I'm going to ask you to see if you can get an answer for us on something. But we were talking earlier about when they started counting absentee ballots. It's 7 a.m. when polls opened, and I don't know when that began. I was always under the impression they started counting them after polls closed. But obviously, with a record number of absentee ballots, if we want to get out of here early tonight, we'd like to know they started counting them early. But if you could find out for us when that happened, because I'm wondering, compared to, say, 2016, when she says there were so many absentee ballots at that time, did they start counting them right away then? I know we've had some late nights in Milwaukee where it has taken them until 11 o'clock midnight or later to get the final results in. It seems like they're planning on getting them in a little earlier than that tonight.
Yeah, she said that they started counting them here. Sorry, you broke up in that question. So let me hope that I get the answer correct here. But they started counting them here when polls opened at 7 o'clock. When we first spoke with Claire Woodall-Vogt, she said that at about 4 o'clock, they were about halfway through the process, and that there's a lot of other stuff that has to happen, but that's why they thought they would be finished by 10 or 11. She also said that a lot of the people in this room tonight were a part of 2020 election when they saw a huge surge of absentee ballots being turned in, and she said they're more efficient than she thinks they've ever been during this process.
Ashley, I know some have complained about what they perceived as late night ballot dumps coming out of cities like Milwaukee or out of Dane County, Milwaukee County. Is that because of the volume of ballots they have to simply go through in these urban areas? That's why it goes so late into the night at times?
Yeah, I mean, they have to count all of these ballots, and then they're tallied here, and then they're taken to the county where they're then added on. So it may look like these extra votes are coming in late at night, but these are being counted throughout the night here. And they said, they want to be open and transparent. This process is an important part of our democracy, and that's why there's observers here. People from the public can come in at any time to make sure what's happening here is safe and fair.
Well, it looks like a nice facility you're in. I guess being at the Wisconsin Center helps. And I'm sure you'll have more for us tonight. Ashley, thank you very much from Central Count.
And I should point out it's about 7:30 p.m. So if you haven't voted yet, you can still go out and vote until 8 p.m. If you're in line when the polls close, you will still get to vote.
Yes, so you just be there by 8, because I think that's an important point. If people hear this now and they think, there's no way I'm going to make it in time, I'll get there and the line's going to be too long. If you're in line by 8, they can't deny you that vote, and know that that's your right. So you still have time if you get to your polling place, and you can register on election day. Bring photo ID, bring an electric bill or something that shows your address. You can still do it. So you've got time. Polls close in a little more than 20 minutes.
Right, and voter ID is required. There have been some changes since the last time we had an election like this. With the presidential election, there were absentee drop boxes. Unmanned boxes, we no longer have those in place. A court found those were not acceptable going forward. There are still drop boxes in clerks' offices, and you can vote by mail in advance, but that's just one of the changes this time around. There was also a lower court ruling that election clerks can no longer fill in missing address information, you know, whether it was the street number, the street name, or the municipality. So there has been some discussion and some efforts and lawsuits trying to hone this process and what is different. In the past, it can be confusing for people that there were ballot drop boxes before and now there are not.
Sure, the rules change every time, and a lot of that has to do with concerns about election security and integrity. And we actually have a piece that we can play for you on that very issue, but it's something that plays into how these elections go every year.
Text messages, web ads, and mailers targeting conservatives.
America has a long tradition of trickery in politics, and it's very possible that this is it.
They take aim at Tim Michaels for not being conservative enough. They urge people to vote for Joan Ellis-Beglinger. She dropped out of the governor's race on September 4th, and she endorsed Michaels. But her name is still on the ballot. Once the Wisconsin Elections Commission certified her in June, her placement was fixed. In this website, set up by outside group Wisconsin Rhino Hunters, it claims the corporate lamestream media wants you to believe you only have two choices for governor. Don't believe them. If you check out her real website, it makes clear she's asking her supporters to vote for Michaels. So who is behind this campaign targeting conservatives? The campaign disclosures list two groups, the Wisconsin Rhino Hunters and the Liberty Group, both based in the same Washington, D.C. office. And Wisconsin Rhino Hunters campaign disclosures reveal spending $624,000 against Tim Michaels, money they gave to the Liberty Group.
We've seen other things like that, people with similar sounding names getting themselves on the ballot to try to confuse the voters and drain votes away from the authentic candidate. So there is something of a tradition of these kinds of tricks.
Don't know the motivation of the new campaign, but with the poll suggesting a tie, every vote could make a difference in who wins Wisconsin.
The latest Marquette Law School poll put Tony Evers and Tim Michaels tied, with 2% going to that independent candidate who dropped out 2 months ago. In the newsroom, Jason Calvi, Fox 6 News.
Election nights, I always think that for Jason Calvi, we always say this is his Super Bowl, but he gets a lot of Super Bowls, right? I mean, politics, he's following it, living it day in and day out, and we get here, and this is when it all comes together. But I don't know anybody who knows Wisconsin politics quite as well as Jason Calvi.
And we're going to be bringing him in here in maybe 15, 20 minutes or so to talk about some of the races he's following closely tonight, which will include the Attorney General's race, which may not get as much attention, but is actually a very important race in Wisconsin.
And it became a lot more important after the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision. That has become a key issue in this Attorney General's race, right?
Right. So we have Democrat Josh Kaul, the incumbent, versus Republican Eric Toney. We talk about other races being expensive, and you would expect that, but this race was actually expensive as well. There was some data that it was the sixth most expensive general election in the country, and we saw these ads too.
And it's an Attorney General's race.
It's an Attorney General's race, but there is power in that office. The Democrats spent more than $4 million. Republicans spent more than $2.5 million, and it comes down to issues like abortion, elections, crime in Milwaukee, and guns. Those are very hot button issues. We mentioned abortion earlier. Tony had said he would uphold the abortion ban, the 1849 law on the books, whereas Kaul has a lawsuit in court fighting it, and has said he will not use his resources to prosecute doctors and nurses and criminalize abortion in this state. Elections, this is another big issue. We talked before about how it's important who is in place in the presidential race, in the governor's office. The Attorney General's race is important as well.
Well, and we've talked about not just in the Attorney General's race, but in terms of prosecuting crime, not to take us off the Attorney General subject, but we were talking about the governor's race earlier, and one thing Tim Michaels has said, and he sort of put on notice DAs, that he says he's going to fire the catch and release DAs, and you wonder how district attorneys might be watching some of these races in terms of how it might affect them. Obviously, Milwaukee County DA John Chisholm was really put on the hot seat after the Waukesha parade tragedy, and this is one of those nights where DAs aren't up for election tonight, and yet sort of some of their future may be determined by some of these races. Obviously, the way crime is dealt with in Wisconsin, an important part of the Attorney General's race.
Absolutely. They've talked about this throughout the campaign. Tony has said that he wants the Attorney General's office to have the authority to step in and prosecute crimes in Milwaukee. And Call said he's not necessarily opposed, but he would want that to be implemented statewide if that were the case. We talked about guns earlier. Tony says he wants to also enforce the rules that are on the books, like felons in possession of a firearm, while Call has said he wants to close loopholes. How many times is it going to take me to say that?
I thought you were saying Albert Pujols, like the St. Louis Cardinals. Totally different.
Right. But those loopholes that you reported on that allow private sales without background checks. But we also mentioned elections before. This is another hot button issue because Tony has said, while he believes Trump lost the 2020 election and there was no widespread voter fraud in Wisconsin, he has also criticized the Wisconsin Elections Commission, which I'm sure we're going to talk about that tonight because the outcome of these races tonight could determine the future of the Wisconsin Elections Commission if we have one. And Call has said, despite Tony having said things about the election being legitimate, he's concerned that a Republican in that office, combined with the legislature, could overrule the people. So,
and those aren't the only statewide offices. So we have governor we've talked about. We have the attorney general. There's also a couple of other statewide races, secretary of state and state treasurer, right?
Yes. So the Secretary of State's office is actually really interesting because in other states, the Secretary of State office actually oversees the elections. That's not the case here in Wisconsin. We have the Wisconsin Elections Commission, a bipartisan group of 6 individuals. But the Secretary of State office in Wisconsin is actually a really small office with just a handful of people. It has a budget of less than $300,000, and it is led by Doug LaFollette, who has, I believe, held this job since 1983. So he has a challenger, Amy Lautenbeck, who has been in politics for a while, but she's campaigning on the idea that the Secretary of State office should be a check on the Wisconsin Election Commission, or even to see some transferring of election administrative duties to the Secretary of State office instead. Now, LaFollette doesn't like that. He also doesn't like that his office has been diminished over the years. It used to be a lot larger. He had a larger budget. He had more people in that office. But that is one tactic Republicans have talked about when they criticize the Wisconsin Elections Commission or say we want to get rid of it entirely. It seems that the power would go to the Secretary of State's office because that's where it lies.
Well, it's
in other
interesting
states.
because in the past, Republicans have talked about eliminating the Secretary of State's office altogether. So one thing we know is, depending on the outcome of this race, the way elections are handled in the state of Wisconsin could change dramatically.
Absolutely. And that's why these races that you may not hear as much about actually matter. And we're talking about a very small office in Wisconsin, but this could become something we hear a lot about if Tim Michels is elected, for example, and Amy Lautenbeck. So we'll see how that impacts the role they play in governing elections going forward. But this could also impact, how they get other business transactions done. Right now, that office does apostille requests, which are international adoptions, business transactions. But most of their responsibilities have been outsourced to other state agencies over the years. Like we did a story earlier this year for Contact 6 with Doug LaFollette, and we went into their offices, which are in the basement of the state capitol. It's a very small office with just a handful of people.
It's not
so
glamorous, is it?
No, he does not like being located in the basement. But there might be a big transformation ahead for the Secretary of State office.
Can you guys tell that Jenna Sachs does her homework? I mean, you've got a lot of information on these races.
I just happened to do a story about that one. You did a story on background checks too. So
well, I'll tell you what you don't know, and what I think I just point. I hope you don't mind me pointing this out. Jenna Sachs didn't have a voice a couple of days ago, and here she is telling you all of these things and doing a tremendous job. So
this is the first time I've projected my voice in 5 days.
And we've only been going 45 minutes. What do you see if we've been going a couple of hours?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. But it's exciting to talk about some of these races because they're going to have very big impacts. And we've been talking a bit about some of the smaller races as well. We can't go through all of them, although I'm sure we'll get some of the results in tonight. But we talked about the supermajority earlier, and I was wondering if you could walk us through how that works, because people have probably heard that term thrown around a bit today.
Yeah, supermajority is an important word today in terms of the way we're watching what's happening both in the state assembly and the state senate. So Republicans have control of the state legislature right now. They have majorities in both the Senate and the assembly. And of course, Tony Evers is currently the governor. So you have divided government. Tony Evers has vetoed a lot of bills. You talked about that earlier, a record number of vetoes. And that has sort of, stopped the Republican agenda from going through. If you're a Democrat, you say that's a good thing. He's playing defense. If you're a Republican, you say he's obstructing the agenda. If they can achieve a supermajority, which is a 2/3 majority in both the assembly and the Senate, they can override the governor's vetoes. And right now, Republicans are 5 seats short of that in the Assembly and 1 seat short of that in the state Senate. And so there are a number of key races to watch that are close that could affect that outcome. The Senate is where the Republicans are seen to be most likely to get that supermajority. They only have to flip 1 seat, and there are a couple of vulnerable seats that were very close races the last time around. The Democrats hold, Republicans are hoping to flip. There are a couple of seats that Democrats are hoping to flip as well, but polls right now are showing that it's not looking very likely that that's going to happen. I mentioned 538, one of those polling groups has looked closely at this, and they seem to think that Republicans will end up with maybe a couple of extra seats there. If you look at the state assembly, the Republicans have a little tougher challenge. They've got to flip 5 seats, and even with the redistricting done the way it's been done that favors Republicans in a lot of these districts, flipping 5 of those seats seems like a tall order. You never know, though. This is one of those situations where, depending on if today becomes a red wave or more of a red trickle, that's that's really the question mark, because as you mentioned before, it's a midterm election. So you've got a Democrat in the White House. That tends to be, at the national level, a better thing for Republicans in the midterms, and vice versa. If it's a Republican in the White House, Democrats do well. That also can carry downstate. So when you have state races, you can see Republicans that hope to do well. If they have a red wave, they could take those 5 seats and then some and get a supermajority. If it's more of a trickle, they're not going to. And then you'd still have Democrats have the ability, or Governor Evers, if he wins, would still have the ability to veto the Republican agenda. All of this is moot if Tim Michels wins, because Republicans are not going to lose the majorities in the Assembly and Senate. They just won't have super majorities, but they won't need it if Tim Michels is governor, because then Republicans would have all 3. So really, there's 2 avenues for Republicans in Wisconsin today to have full control of the state legislature and the governor's office. One is to have enough power to override a veto of Tony Evers. The other is to have Tim Michels in the governor's office.
And when it comes to possibly flipping some seats, there are some more local races that we are keeping our eye on tonight. One of them is the 5th Senate District in Brookfield and Elm Grove. That district has been redistricted and now extends further into Waukesha County. So it's become more Republican. So it's expected it will go that way tonight. Another district is the 13th Assembly District, also in Brookfield. It was flipped by Democrats in 2020. Now it also seems to be becoming more Republican with the new maps as well. So we'll see if that is enough to reach those 5 votes, and that 1 vote or 1 seat and 5 seats needed. But I'm sure Republicans feel like they are in striking distance, right, of achieving this. They probably taste it. But at the same time, Democrats may be equally motivated to keep their goalie in place, which is what Tony Evers has essentially been, is the Democratic goalie, using that veto pen more than 120 times in the last session to block these bills. And likewise, the Republicans in the legislature have blocked his efforts to do various things, provide more funding to schools, for example, to municipalities. So it goes both ways. But we have, let's see, 15 minutes left until the polls close, a little less. So if you haven't gotten out there yet, you can still do so. And remember, if you're
You just looked
in
past
line,
me. I noticed that the
there's a
laptop
clock right
that
there.
says 7:47. I'm looking at a clock over there that's a little behind, because I thought, or ahead. Though we only
Is
had
it
10
10
minutes,
minutes
so I've
left?
probably been speaking a little too far ahead in time. But yeah.
And we
a
should
little less than
also
15
mention,
minutes.
while we're at it, there were some other questions on the ballot today too, some referendums. I know
A lot of them, actually, and they're probably getting overshadowed by these big races because there's so much out there. But there's a lot of those referendums in local communities all across the state.
We know that in Milwaukee and Kenosha, there have been referendums about guns, about marijuana. Someone who is Jason Calvey's really interested in those Town of Randall golf carts.
There's always going to be a golf cart referendum somewhere, and we have golf carts on the street.
Right. So we mentioned marijuana. The city of Kenosha is voting on whether marijuana should be legalized for adult use, taxed and regulated like alcohol. Likewise, marijuana is being voted on. Advisory referendums in Milwaukee County, asking if they're in favor of allowing people to engage in commercial use of marijuana. And then we mentioned guns earlier. Kenosha County and Milwaukee County having very different referendums on that topic, because Kenosha County is asking if the state legislature should declare Wisconsin to be a Second Amendment sanctuary state, whereas in Milwaukee County, they're asking voters if they should be able to prohibit the import, sale, manufacture, or possession of semi-automatic military-style firearms. So very different approaches to those questions.
Well, it's one of those things when we talk about what's on the ballot, it really depends on where you are when you go to your polling place, because your ballot looks a whole lot different from your ballot or my ballot or somebody else's, especially in some of those local communities. And while they may be smaller issues, we may not be able to flash up the numbers on the town of Randall, a golf cart referendum, although unless Jason Calvi really pushes for it. But those sorts of things are very important to local communities. And there are 249 of those referendums all across the state of Wisconsin today, in addition to these other races. You and I have been talking about the sort of razor thin.
Oh,
We
look.
already have results?
No, we
Oh,
don't.
no, that's the, we're talking
We
about
will
where
have
they're
the
going to be.
results
I
on
was like,
Fox 6 now.
we can't have them yet. The polls aren't closed.
Right. So this is a look at our website, fox6now.com. And also you can see 0% because they haven't closed the polls yet. But we'll be reporting these numbers as they come in as well if we have these results while we're streaming live and then when we're on Fox 6 News starting at 9 o'clock.
Are you able to show us our just Fox 6 Now website? Because I know that I was looking at this earlier and I want to show people, because you can do this on your own if you punch it up. You look there on the right-hand side, you see how we've got these maps. If you go to our website, especially, it works best on a desktop computer or on your phone browsing as opposed to using the Fox 6 News app. But you can see these maps that are going to show you the balance of power. As you see right now, we're already seeing some results come in from the eastern states where polls are already closed and things have happened quickly. You can see the House seats that all 435 House seats were up for election today in Congress, but you're starting to see some early returns. These are probably races that weren't particularly close, so they're able to call them early. So there's nothing super meaningful early on just yet, most likely. Same thing in the United States Senate. There are still 26 Senate seats left in play. When we get down to the final few, the ones that are the real tight races, that's where we're really going to know. And we've talked about some of those tight races for a long time. The Barnes and Johnson race was seen as one of those really epic close races that was going to decide, and it still could. In the last maybe few days, pollsters are starting to say this one's not as close as a few others. Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania. With some really tight races there that could swing the balance of power in the United States Senate.
And some that have gotten quite a bit of attention, right? We have the Pennsylvania race, Oz versus Fetterman, Georgia, Herschel Walker versus Raphael Warnock. So these are also races I'm sure you have come to your attention within the last few weeks. So
a lot of celebrity power in there too. Dr. Oz and one of them, Herschel Walker, obviously the former NFL player, and has been a lot of controversy in those races. I know that Oprah Winfrey just recently came out against Dr. Oz in favor of his opponent, and obviously he launched his career really on the Oprah Winfrey show. So there's a lot going on in those races, but it's not just celebrity status. There's some really important political power to be determined in terms of who wins these races. And those four, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, and Pennsylvania, could really decide where the Senate goes and who has the power in the United States Senate.
Because as we mentioned before, right now the Senate, the U.S. Senate is split 50-50 with Kamala Harris as the tiebreaker vote. And obviously this doesn't allow them to pass sweeping legislation. The president has had challenges getting things passed, but this slim margin does help with important things like approving nominees and launching investigations. So if that balance of power changes, it could make a drastic difference on what happens in the country.
On the House of Representatives side, Republicans are expected to pick up seats. They're definitely expected to win back control of the U.S. House of Representatives. The question is how much of a wave might that be? As I talked about earlier, is it going to be a big red wave? Is it going to be a tiny trickle? Most pollsters are saying, though, that the House is one that seems to be firmly in the grasp of Republicans winning. The Senate is the one that's still a toss-up, and we're going to find out a lot more about that in the coming hours.
And, you know, we're getting closer and closer to the polls closing. So before we start to maybe anticipate some results coming in, we should talk about someone else who's on the ballot, pretty high up on the ballot that we haven't, the lieutenant governor candidate.
It's easy to overlook lieutenant governor, right? Mandela Barnes would probably say that's been overlooked quite a bit, but he is obviously not running for lieutenant governor because he is running for U.S. Senate.
And many people see this job as a stepping stone. It doesn't have a lot of actual responsibilities, although many governors see their lieutenant governor as someone who helps advance their agenda, get out the word, meet the people. But our next lieutenant governor will either be Democrat Sarah Rodriguez or Republican Roger Roth. Again, no incumbent in this race. And it's elected like the governor, every 4 years. But, it's a job where the day-to-day responsibilities are flexible. They can maybe make the role what they want it to be, or they could use it as a stepping stone. But a bit about Sarah Rodriguez. She is from Brookfield. She's an elected member of the state assembly. In the past, she's been a registered nurse. She's worked in public health and healthcare. She's been a small business owner and a former healthcare executive. She identifies her top issues as public health, not surprisingly, education, economy, abortion rights, and the climate. Roger Roth, on the other hand, serves in the Wisconsin State Senate. He is from Appleton, representing parts of Outagamie and Winnebago counties. He formerly served in the assembly, so both of these individuals have some political experience. Roger Roth, you may remember, he emerged from that crowded primary with 8 Republicans.
That's right, yeah.
That was quite the event. In the past, he's managed his family's construction business, captain in the Wisconsin Air National Guard, and he says his top issues are economy, school choice, election integrity, safe streets, and he's also pro-life. So that's a little background on the lieutenant governors, who often are overshadowed by the governor. Everyone is speaking
But the
about
lieutenant
the race.
governor's position often does lead to people seeking higher office. If you look at, obviously, former Lieutenant Governor Rebecca Clayfish, who ran for governor this year and was sort of late in the game, upstaged by Tim Michaels, who came into got the Trump endorsement, and then sort of swung right on through to victory in the primary.
And that was really interesting because, remember, Rebecca Clayfish had Pence's endorsement and Michaels had Trump's endorsement. Trump came here and he rallied with him. Interestingly, he did not come during the weeks and months leading up to this election. So whether that was a conscious decision or not, I tend to think in campaigns, everything is a conscious decision. Maybe they didn't think Trump would play as well with independent voters that they were trying to sway in order.
It may have been that he's just been busy in Pennsylvania and other places.
Exactly. He's still been trumping for other people. So, it's just interesting. We talked a lot last time about Clayfish and her work in the Walker administration and her kind of representing maybe the old Republican Party, and Michaels being that outsider, that businessman, less in the political mainstream, representing the new Republican Party. So we'll see if this is a continuation of that tonight, or whether we see Tony Evers hold on to the spot.
We don't have results coming in yet. Polls are about to close here in just the next 4 or 5 minutes. When we do see them come in, I guess one thing we know is that there's been some pretty good turnout. We already know absentee ballots were at a record level. It's interesting. It's hard to gauge sometimes just what turnout's like by what the lines are at a polling place because of all of that early voting that now takes place. But when I saw Amelia Jones, our reporter who was in Cedarburg this morning, posting videos to Twitter of the lines outside the Cedarburg Community Center, and they were around the block. And in spite of all of that early voting, a lot of people showing up the polls. I imagine we're going to see huge numbers. And we've been seeing over the past 6 general elections, the numbers keep getting bigger and bigger. The one year that there was really a big spike that maybe hasn't been matched was when Barack Obama was elected president in 2012. In certain locations, the numbers were off the charts. But by and large, there is more and more people coming to these general elections and showing up at the polls, whether it's through early voting or on election day. And I think we're probably seeing something very similar happen today.
And there's always a lot of attention paid to certain voting groups leading up to the election. I know we've talked about Latino voters, we've talked about young voters, and whether those groups turn out and whether that sways the outcome. I know Jason Calvi did a story recently about whether the young people will turn out as they have in past races. Historically, they don't turn out as much as their older, peers. So it'll be interesting to see the breakdown. Oh, we're getting Jason Calvi over here to talk about some of the outcomes in a little bit.
We're going to have Jason come in a minute. I think as the polls are closing, we've had a number of pieces kind of prepared, ready for you to play. And I don't have a great transition to this one, but I know we're prepared to play a little something as we talked about with the U.S. Senate race. Obviously, it's a hotly contested race between Ron Johnson and Mandela Barnes. And one of the issues, we know the economy is huge, we know crime is huge, but one of the issues that they've faced off against each other on is abortion. That's been an issue that's obviously played a role in this election. And if we've got that piece ready to play, do we have that we can bring up?
Let's do it.
So we're gonna
The U.S. Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade in June. That's when the long-dormant Wisconsin abortion ban from 1849 sprung back to life.
It's obviously an issue that impacts women, but on the whole, it's an issue that impacts everybody. And I wish more men thought about it that way.
Democrat Mandela Barnes toured the state with his Ron Against Roe tour. Senator Johnson praised reversing Roe. And in 2011, he co-sponsored the Life at Conception Act. The bill's summary says it would declare that the right to life guaranteed by the Constitution is vested in each human being beginning at the moment of fertilization.
All that acknowledges that life begins at conception. I believe that.
Democrats disagree, saying the proposal would lead to abortion being considered murder with no exceptions.
I've always supported the, exceptions.
Post-Roe, Johnson proposes a statewide referendum for the people to decide how far along in pregnancy an abortion could take place.
What point does society have the responsibility to protect life? What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to figure out a way that we can form that consensus where we, the people, make that choice.
Can you tell us where you would stand right now as
I would obviously protect life at some stage.
On that referendum, where would you stand right now as far as 10 weeks, 15 weeks? I mean, where would you draw that line?
You can see where I have supported protecting life after 20 weeks. That's 5 months.
Earlier this week, I questioned Barnes on timelines. Would you support any restrictions on abortion up until birth, for example?
Well, I'll tell you, I support us going back to Roe. It's the law that worked for 50 years.
But Roe v. Wade allowed states to restrict and even ban abortion after viability, with exceptions to save the mother. On Wednesday, he said he opposed time limits.
This is about treating each individual situation as they are. You can't legislate a specific timeline.
And we have our Fox 6 political reporter, Jason Calvi, joining us now. Thank you so much. I know this is a really busy night for you. On the topic of abortion, we know that's one of a number of issues that became the focal point of a number of campaign ads over the last few weeks, months. Can you tell us a bit about campaign spending? Because this has been quite a historic race.
It really has, and what we're seeing is you see how important Wisconsin is when you look at the campaign ad spending. Wisconsin's Senate race, we just heard from both of those candidates. Wisconsin's Senate race, 5th in the nation in total money spent on the U.S. Senate race. We're seeing $144 million spent on both campaigns here in Wisconsin in this general election matchup.
$144 million. We just spit these numbers out now like they're nothing, but that's a huge amount of money.
Huge amount, and it's unprecedented. What we're seeing, for example, the governor's race is now the most expensive governor's race in Wisconsin state history. And it's far exceeds the last record, which was 2018. So you can just imagine what 4 more years is going to mean as far as the campaign spending. But it shows how crucially important Wisconsin is seen both at the state level and then at the national level. We've got the Senate race, we've got the governor's race, really considered toss-ups in the polls. And we're seeing all that money trying to convince these voters, these persuadable voters, to come out and vote for one candidate or the other.
Jason, I know we've talked a little bit about it, Jenna and I, but you've been following closely the issue of the supermajority in the state legislature. For Republicans, obviously, that's a goal to achieve 2/3 majority in the Senate and the Assembly, especially if they aren't able to unseat Governor Tony Evers. Can you talk about the importance of that to Republicans and to what happens between the governorship and the state legislature?
Right. So when we look at Governor Evers, I mean, he has got the record here. We keep talking about records, but Governor Evers has right now the state record for single legislative session. So that's the 2-year session of the legislature. He has the most, historically, he's got the top number of vetoes in a single legislative session. He's if he wins re-election, he'd be on pace to potentially set the all-time record for vetoes in Wisconsin state history.
And whether that's good or bad depends on what perspective you're coming from.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But definitely both sides can agree historic number of vetoes coming from Governor Evers in a single legislative session. He's vetoed bills on all the controversial issues that you can think of right now: guns, elections, abortion, and the list goes on. Schools. I mean, the list goes on and on. You got a Republican legislature right now. You got a Democratic governor. He has used his veto pen quite a bit to veto these bills. And with a supermajority, Republicans really are on the cusp of a supermajority. With a supermajority, what it would allow Republicans to do, if Governor Evers is reelected, is it would allow them to then override the governor's veto, enact those laws that he rejects. They override, and it becomes law. So again, all those issues we talked about: elections, abortion, schools, guns. Those bills could become law depending on how voters decide today, if they give the Republicans a supermajority and they elect Governor Evers for another term.
Looking a little further down the ballot, what are some of the other races you're tracking tonight that you're particularly interested in?
Well, I think because of this issue of the legislative supermajority potential, veto-proof supermajority, I'm definitely looking at some of the the legislative races. So we've got a couple in our viewing range that are potential toss-ups, or at least, for example, former Milwaukee alderman, he ran for mayor. Did you guys mention him earlier?
We haven't talked, yeah, right.
But Bob Donovan, former Milwaukee alderman, now running in the 84th Assembly District. And that district is a district that voted for Joe Biden in 2020 by about 2 points. It's considered a toss-up right now. It could be one of those ones that that Democrats could take. It's one that was controlled by the Republicans, but it's become a little bit more competitive. One of the Senate race, because we've had redistricting, right? Every census,
that district used to be dominated by Republicans,
right,
but it was drawn very differently.
Yeah, and that map, that district has gotten a more competitive, more favorable to the Democrats. But again, it was a 2-point lead for Biden, President Biden in 2020. Republicans see it as a good year for them, because if you look at the statistics on a midterm election like we are right now, when the president's party tends to lose seats both in Congress and the Senate, typically there's an average here of them losing seats in Congress. So potentially it would be a good year for Republicans historically, based on the fact that we have a Democratic president. Historically, it would mean a good, maybe a better year for the Republicans.
Well, that's one thing that early on in the year, I think that has been the full expectation this would be a good year for Republicans in the midterms. And then something pretty significant happened, and that was the United States Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade. And at the time, certainly there was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm that generated for those who felt that was the wrong decision. And what I wonder is, between then and now, has the enthusiasm over that issue waned? Where does it stack up against what voters say are the most important issues in this election?
It's kind of interesting when we talk to Democrats, the top issue again and again from Democrats, and this is found in the polls as well, the Marquette poll that came out just last week. Top issue for Democrats, abortion. Top issue for Republicans, inflation. Okay, when it comes down to the polls and you say, are you a Democrat? Okay, are you going to vote for the Democrat? 95 or more % say, yeah, I'm going to vote for my party's candidate. What we're looking at is those independent voters. The independent voters are the ones that make this, a swing state, right? So we're looking at, well, what's the most important issues for the swing voters? And it's not abortion. Abortion's down the list for them. For the independent voters, according to the latest Marquette poll, the most important issue is inflation in public schools. So this is an opening potentially for Republicans who have been talking about, they've been talking a lot about crime. They've also been talking about inflation and kind of blaming the rising inflation on the Democrats and President Biden. So that gives an opening for Republicans to somehow win over some of these independent swing voters that make us a swing state. And we've seen some of that in the polling as well, as far as what the most important issues for them are. And then we've seen sort of Republicans sort of trending right now toward doing better in the state of Wisconsin. But
Sarah,
again, it all comes down not to the polls, but to how people vote today.
Sarah, can you get those graphics? Because you're talking about the independents and them being the ones who swing things. But obviously, enthusiasm and turnout for both sides is huge. Yeah. And when we look at what's happened in the state of Wisconsin over the last 6 general elections, last 3 presidential, last 2 governor's races, last 3 governors and last 3. This is Milwaukee County. And while it's always been dominated by the Democratic vote in this time period, that those trend lines you see, the gap between the margin of victory for Democrats in Milwaukee County has continued to go up. In Waukesha County, by contrast, and we have another chart, but I think Sarah had to step away for a moment, but there's another chart that shows the opposite is happening in Waukesha County, where it is still dominated by Republicans, but the margin of victory is shrinking. And so I do wonder, in an issue like abortion, if that's the top issue for Democrat voters, does it do enough to generate the enthusiasm to get them out in places like Milwaukee and Dane County in numbers that are enough to keep seeing that go up? Could that have an impact on something like this, where it's expected to be a red wave, but maybe not as big of a red wave as it might have been otherwise?
Exactly. I mean, that's the key is turnout, and it all comes down to who turns out the votes. And again, it comes back to what we saw a little bit earlier with the campaign spending and how we're at record levels, both at the governor's race, record levels spent in the governor's race. And it comes down to that issue of turnout and who shows up. And that's going to be the crucial issue. When we look at the numbers of people who voted in previous midterm elections, so our last governor's race in 2018, we saw 2.6 million people vote. So a lot less than vote in a presidential election. That's just typical. People are much more concerned about a presidential year. They come out and vote in record numbers or higher numbers in those presidential years. But we're seeing some anecdotal evidence tonight of higher turnout than we saw in 2018. So we're seeing some of these polling places where we're checking the numbers and comparing them to what the total vote totals were in 2018. We're already seeing, well, now the polls are closed, but when we had some numbers coming in earlier this evening, they were already beating 2018. And some of the polling
is that even with absentee ballots? Because we know that those are at record numbers as well, which would seem to potentially reduce the number of people coming out on election day.
Right, and that's what we're going to be looking at as well as those absentee ballots, which, by the way, are going to take, as we know, they take longer to process. They take longer to count. Why? Well, they come in an envelope. The two election officials, two election inspectors have to open up the envelope. They have to, first of all, check to make sure, is there a voter signature here? Is there a witness signature? Is there a witness address? All that has to be inspected by the inspectors before they can even open up the envelope. Then they open up the envelope, and what happens? The ballot is folded up. They have to get it ready and iron it out so it can go through the machine. So it's a process.
Lot of work to be done.
It's
Absolutely.
a lot. I went and voted today, in person, and just boom, right in the machine, and it's done. But with the absentee ballot, it takes a lot longer. And guess what? In Milwaukee County, the city of Milwaukee, we have central count, which means we're not going to get the results of those absentee ballots until all of those ballots are done. You cannot report a voting unit until all the votes in that voting unit are completed. So it's going to take a long time to count all those absentee ballots, and they can't report those numbers until for that voting unit, for that central count, for the absentee ballots, until all of those votes are counted in that voting unit. So it's going to be a long night, and guess what? It's going to tilt the scales because Milwaukee is a heavily,
as those numbers showed,
is a heavily Democratic city and county, and so it won't be surprising when those numbers finally come in tonight that it will give a little boost to the Democrats. Now, depending on how the rest of the state polls, we'll see if there's that red wave in Wisconsin or not. It's really anybody's guess right now. The pollsters are definitely watching it. They're giving a slight advantage to the Republicans here in Wisconsin right now. At least some of the polling kind of estimating groups, the projectors, others are calling it a toss-up. So really, it's see what happens now as these votes are counted tonight.
Big night ahead, Jason.
And we always appreciate your enthusiasm and your energy, because I know you've got a lot of hours ahead of you tonight, so you're going to need that. Speaking of energy, I know
socks. I'm hearing something about socks. What was it about socks?
Do you have election socks
look at this.
on?
We've got.
Does that violate the flag code to have?
Oh no.
I don't. It's not a real flag, but it has the.
You're a star, Jason. That's what that says.
Well,
Thanks again, Jason, for taking the time.
And speaking of people who have enthusiasm, I know we have Mordecai Lee, our political analyst, who will be in here in just a minute.
And we'll be getting him set up. I do want to, and Sarah, I don't know if you can bring up, we showed the Milwaukee County chart. If you can bring up the Waukesha chart for just a moment, because I want to sort of visually demonstrate what we were talking about earlier. And I think this is something I'm going to ask Mordecai about here in a little bit. It is the gap in margin of victory that's been changing over the course of the last several general elections. You look back to 2010 when Scott Walker became governor, beating Tom Barrett. Waukesha County, as an example, obviously huge domination for Republicans over Democratic voters. Republicans still get far more of the vote in Waukesha County than do Democrats, but that gap is shrinking. In Milwaukee County, it's the converse, which we showed you just a little bit earlier. The gap is actually widening in terms of Democratic vote over the Republicans in Milwaukee County. So while Milwaukee County and Dane County, for example, still getting a lot more of a Democratic vote, and in the WOW counties, Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington getting more Republican votes, the margin of victory are changing. That's one of the reasons in the last few general elections we've seen these razor-thin margins, and that is something that I do want to talk to our guests that we're going to bring in right here. Of course, we have Mordecai Lee here on the far left, and I'm so sorry you have to introduce yourself to me.
I'm Paru Shah from UWM.
Thank you very much for being here. So, Mordecai, I want to start with you on this because we just showed these charts with this. The gaps remain. I mean, we know that Milwaukee County is going to be heavily Democratic. We know that the WOW counties are going to lean Republican, but the margins are changing, the margin of victory. What does that do to the overall sort of razor-thin margins we've been seeing in these general elections?
You know, it's an odd demographic trend because the city of Milwaukee is highly Democratic, but the suburbs, especially the southern and southwestern suburbs, are largely Republican. It's Tosa that's been turning Democratic and the North Shore that's been turning Democratic. But conversely, I think we should look at the sort of, we used to call them soccer moms of Waukesha County. they're the ones who are conservative on economic issues, but they're pro-choice. And the way they break tonight may well decide who the next governor and senator are.
We have talked a lot, Jason and I were, and Jenna were just talking about the Republicans seeking a supermajority in the state legislature, both the Senate and the legislature. And of course, that only matters if Governor Evers is reelected, because if it's Tim Michels, then they don't need a supermajority to get their agenda through. And I wonder about if Tony Evers wins, is it still possible for Republicans to get that supermajority? And if so, what does that say about the makeup, sort of maybe the urban-rural split in Wisconsin right now?
You want to go first?
No, go ahead.
I'll make a prediction. Because this is not going to be on tape, I can be wrong and nobody will be able to prove that I was wrong. I think tonight's going to be an overwhelmingly red tsunami. In other words, not just Republicans winning here or there, but winning across the board and by large margins. They ran a brilliant campaign defining the agenda both nationally and locally as inflation and crime. And that touched people. You know, to appeal to people on more abstract issues like let's save democracy, that just doesn't have the same magnetic pull. So I think you're right about a supermajority. And I also happen to think that Michels is going to win. What do you think, Peru?
So I'm going to disagree. And I think because you brought up the soccer moms, and I think the abortion issue is really mobilizing Democrats in a way that, you know, we saw throughout the other primaries, and I think we're going to see here in Wisconsin as well.
Well, and on that question, we were talking about this earlier. When the Supreme Court's decision, the Dobbs decision, came out overturning Roe v. Wade, obviously enthusiasm was at its highest. A lot of time has passed since then. Has that enthusiasm to get Democrats out at the polls who want to protect abortion rights, has that waned in that time? And is that a concern in terms of trying to hold off what would be a red tsunami?
I mean, I would say no. I mean, if you look at the Marquette polls for the last month, that's still the top three for the Democrats. And so I think it still continues to push people. And I think the Democrats have really been campaigning around this idea that if you want to protect women's reproductive rights, this is what you need to do.
I know. Go ahead, Mordecai. Yes.
We got to talk a little bit about statistics. Not a lot, just a little bit. The turnout 4 years ago in the governor's election was about 2.66 million. That compares to, in a presidential race, about 3 million Wisconsinites. So the number to keep our eye on is the turnout higher than about 2.66 million? I think it's possible that we might get closer to 3 million. In other words, just a huge turnout. Now, whether that's a Republican or a Democratic tsunami is to be seen, but if it goes up, what we're seeing is that Wisconsinites are voting almost at presidential levels in a gubernatorial race. The last three governor's races, the percentage of the registered population that voted has been going up. It almost hit 60% in the last governor's race. So tonight we want to pay attention to that.
How much of that is affected by the tremendous level of spending that we've seen in these campaigns, both the governor's race and the U.S. Senate race, unprecedented levels of spending?
I mean, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the amount of outside money coming into Wisconsin and, as you were saying, the razor thin margins, right, means that we're going to see kind of the impact of that kind of spending here. And I do think it has mobilized people and also polarized folks, right? So more people are coming out to vote, but it's not like people are, I don't think, changing their minds about who they were going to vote for.
And we talked about supermajorities here in the state of Wisconsin, but the balance of power in Congress is also in play. What do you see happening there? And I'll let either of you take that. What do you see? What do you expect to see tonight?
My prediction is the Republican tsunami is not just locally, but nationally. I predict they're going to take the House and the Senate. But nonetheless, there's still a Democratic president. And so in a sense, what will happen to politics in Washington will be what's happened in Wisconsin in the last 4 years, where there was a governor of one party and a legislature of the other party. And they sort of, you got a technical stalemate from that.
Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the likelihood of the Republicans taking both the Senate and the House are high. Again, I'm going to be hopeful that I think it's good for government to have debate, have democratic kind of civil discourse. And so I hope that that's not the case, because I think that a deadlock will be something that we'll see otherwise.
Can I just add one more thing about statistics? The other number to pay attention to is that when Evers beat Scott Walker 4 years ago, he won by 30,000 votes out of 2.66 million cast. It was 1.1%. And based on what Wisconsin politics has turned into in the last couple of elections, that was a landslide compared to Biden winning Wisconsin by 21,000 votes, Trump before that winning Wisconsin by 23,000 votes. So we need to pay attention to just that tiny little margin, and a 1% win is big for a deep purple state like ours.
Well, and that's when you talk about statistics, if you go to the 3 general elections before that, you're talking 5 or 6% margins as opposed to less than 1% or 1%. Is that something we expect to keep seeing going forward? Is these razor thin within a percentage point races in Wisconsin?
I mean, I would say yes. I think that the electorate this is a very purple state, and we're seeing kind of further kind of polarization from the candidates. I feel like there's like the Venn diagram of things that Republicans and Democrats agree on in Wisconsin has gotten very, very small. And so I don't, I continue to see, right, to your point, 20, 30,000 votes making the difference.
I think what's been changing in Wisconsin politics, partly because of Scott Walker, is that people are taking their partisan identity much more seriously. It used to be when Tommy Thompson was governor, he used to say that 1/3 of the state were swing voters, independent voters. Now we're down to like this 1%. What does that mean? This means that people wake up in the morning and they say, I'm a Republican. I'm always going to vote a Republican. I don't care. And equally, people say, I'm a Democrat. I'm going to vote Democratic. So the number of people who are actually listening to those ads is so tiny because people are holding this identity of their partisan affiliation so deeply. It's sort of like religion or their ethnic background. It's very, very powerful.
But of course, the key is, do they go to the polls, right? Because you can be entrenched as to who you're going to vote for, but you still have to go and actually vote. Is that really where those ads maybe play, is not necessarily changing minds, but encouraging people or reminding them, oh yeah, I've got to get out and vote?
I mean, I think the research shows that ads work, but not as much as things like get out the vote mobilization efforts and on the ground efforts. And so we've also seen kind of like a blanketing of that happening here, particularly in Milwaukee. And so, I mean, I think to Mordecai's point, right, like we're talking about 1 or 2%, right? So millions of dollars being spent on these 2% of people who might be mobilized to vote and maybe make up their mind based on those ads. So I don't know.
Right. And Brian, I think you've really touched on something in terms of mobilizing people to vote. It used to be the conventional wisdom that sort of white men with lower levels of income, lower levels of education, living in the rural areas, high school graduates, they don't vote. It was Trump that just converted them into voters. And so to get them to vote, perhaps those ads are just sort of triggering this intense emotion that they're just dying to vote, even though for most of their lives they didn't.
You bring up Donald Trump, and I do wonder something, because we have an interesting race, which is Robin Vos is running unopposed. But of course, there's a write-in campaign that Donald Trump is endorsing, the person that he beat in the primary, Adam Steen. And I raise that not because it seems as though this write-in candidate is going to beat Robin Vos in the general election here, but it raises the question of, if Republicans do have this tsunami, and if they do have control of all the houses of the legislature and the governor's office in Wisconsin, what happens within the Republican Party? Is there still sort of a competition within that party over those two wings?
You know, even though Robin Vos stood up to President Trump in that sort of final get, still, I think that the Republican Party in the legislature is a Trump party, and I think that Michaels will be a Trump governor. And so whether we're talking about people who are even farther to the right, or if we're talking about the old Republican establishment, sort of the Rebecca Clayfish, more moderate kind of Republican conservative, I think they're just sort of washed away.
I don't know. I know you guys, I could keep you around forever. If we've got a wrap, I'm getting the sort of the wrap signal because I'm going to let you guys get over on the air. Mordecai Park, thank you so much for taking the time, and I guess we'll see how this goes. Are we saying we do have some results starting to come in? Okay, so as we send you guys on your way, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And I'm sure we have a long night ahead, but we're starting to see some results rolling in.
Oh,
and
right,
I can't see them at the moment because Jeff's trying to unmic Barb. But you guys can see on your end the very early returns, 3% of precincts reporting, and you see the Tony Evers right now with 27,000 votes to Tim Michaels, 9,900. These numbers are obviously very, very early and very preliminary, so we're not going to draw conclusions because we don't know where they come from. U.S. Senate, we see Mandela Barnes right now with 70% to Ron Johnson's 30%. Attorney General, you've got Eric Toney, by contrast, with a 51 to 49% lead over the Democratic incumbent Josh Call. Secretary of State, the Republican, actually, we don't have any results there as we see. I think, that I just lose something? No, I didn't. Okay. I didn't know if my IFB came out, Jeff. I can still hear things. All right. So what you see right there on the FOX6now.com, this is our FOX6 website, I should say, our main page. If you go on a desktop computer, or if you're on your phone, use your browser to go to fox6now.com, because these maps are going to be a little more useful than they are on the app. That's what I'm told by our web team. So if you're on your phone, you can go to fox6now.com, but use a browser to get there. And these maps are going to continue to show you what's happening with the balance of power in the United States House, the United States Senate, and of course the balance of power in the legislature in the state of Wisconsin. You can see we're getting early returns in right now. There it is, 41 seats for the Democrats in the Senate, 39 for Republicans, with 20 left to go. But I doubt we've gotten any decisions yet on some of the really close races that are going to decide where that lands.
Right. Of course, they were predicting that we would be up very late tonight, that we wouldn't have the outcomes of these races. So while it's exciting to see some numbers start to roll in, obviously they're very preliminary, but it will be exciting to see what the outcomes are for the big races, the governor's race, the U.S. Senate race that you were discussing with Mordecai as well, also the Attorney General, and a number of local representatives as well. So it was interesting to listen to you and Mordecai talk about his take on the transitions that have
He's
been
never
happening
shy
in the
about telling you what he thinks. That's for sure. He's got and it's well researched. He's looking at the data. He's obviously he comes in well prepared. It's always great to have him on and his insight. You talked about what a late night this might be. I will say this. I don't know if my wife is watching right now, but she asked, well, what do you think you'll be home? I said, don't expect me before midnight, because I just feel like with the numbers Mordecai was just talking about, if there's 3 million voters in this election, 3 million. That's, what is that? That's roughly 60% of the state's population, not just registered voters. It's even higher. So obviously we're talking about a really high turnout election. The more voters there are, the longer it takes for clerks to count those votes and get those results in.
Right. And anecdotally, we've been hearing a number of stories. I know we had a live reporter this morning who showed very long lines in Cedarburg. I know someone who was in line in the North Shore this morning. There were 100 people in line when the poll opened at 7 a.m. So there are a number of people who have reported anecdotally that they've been waiting in long lines, and we've been hearing that turnout is expected to be high. But again, we know that Democrats are motivated, Republicans are motivated. It's all going to come down to those independents, because in Wisconsin, races are often decided by 1% or 1.5% of the vote, or even less than 1%. And it's interesting to see how our state goes back and forth. You know, one year we have Trump, one year we have Biden winning the vote. So we're a very purple state.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned that,
motivated.
because, and I don't have data that we're going to be able to throw up on the screen, but I will just kind of flash at you that I've got all these charts, these tables that I've built, because I love Microsoft Excel. I'm kind of a data nerd. But one of the things I was looking at is what's happened over these recent general elections in terms of trends. And if you look at Milwaukee County, obviously the Democrats won every time. If you look at Dane County, the Democrats won every time. If you look at the WOW counties, Waukesha, Ozaukee, Washington, the Republicans win every time. Statewide, it's back and forth. You had Walker winning in 2010 for the governorship, Obama winning the state on his way to becoming president. You had Walker winning again in 2014 on his way to repeating as governor. Then President Trump winning in 2016 by a razor-thin margin. Tony Evers defeating Walker. And then, of course, Joe Biden winning the state of Wisconsin by just around 20,000 votes a couple of years ago. So it's flipped back and forth. And where it goes this year, is this going to flip back to being a Tim Michels victory for governor, or are we going to see Tony Evers repeat and hold his seat? Remains to be seen, but obviously the state has bounced back and forth.
Right, and I wonder if we'll see the results tonight bounce a bit back and forth too. We don't know where they're coming from, whether it's more rural or urban, or more Democrat or Republican. So we should expect that a bit tonight. Or we'll see if Republicans have more momentum than we thought. I know the predictions have been that Republicans had more momentum going into this race, but it was still expected to be close, because the polls have shown the governor's race to be neck and neck, essentially tied. The U.S. Senate race was a separation of 2%, with Ron Johnson out ahead, although polls have typically underestimated his turnout. But again, the Marquette Law School poll has shown that people are interested in issues like inflation, gun control, abortion. There's a number of motivators people could have. And as Mordecai pointed out, what the independents are thinking, what matters to them, will be interesting to see what brings them to the polls. Because as you mentioned before, maybe abortion isn't the issue for everybody in different counties as it is a motivator for the Democrats. But yeah, we're following a number of other races. The Attorney General's race will be interesting to see how that goes tonight. It may be along party lines, maybe it won't be. But
for those statewide races, yeah, I mean, you tend to think that, for instance, if Tony Evers were to win, then you would see Josh Cull winning as Attorney General. If you see Tim Michels win as governor, you would see Eric Toney win. Don't know if that's going to play out that way,
Mhm.
but for those statewide races, you might expect that. What I think will be interesting to see is, depending on who wins the statewide races, what happens with those local races, the Senate and the Assembly, where obviously the balance of power is in play as Republicans seek a supermajority in both of those chambers. If Governor Evers wins and holds on to a seat in the governor's office, will Republicans still be able to take some of those local districts that give them enough control to withstand his veto power?
And we can
don't
also
know.
mention on
Remains to be seen.
FOX6Now.com, we do have other races for other states. I know we've been monitoring Senate races that could flip the.
I'm going to flip
shift
through my
the
notes as you
power
bring that
well.
up, because
there's
there are a number.
Georgia, there's Nevada, there's a number of different state races that you can see on our website as well. So if you're interested in the outcome of that and how that will affect the balance of power in Washington, because that's a big reason people are paying attention to the Ron Johnson race, right? Because we've seen a lot of dollars pumped in for the sole reason that that is expected to be one of those one of those seats that maybe could be flipped. But momentum might be on Ron Johnson's side. We don't know. Here are some more results coming in. Let's see. With just 6%, we have Tony Evers with 60%, Tim Michaels 39%, and U.S. Senate Mandela Barnes 60% to Ron Johnson's 40%, with just 6% reporting. But interesting, let's see, not as many in for Josh Kaul and Eric Toney. So it appears right now the Democrats are out ahead, but again, we don't know where these numbers are coming from, and it's still a very low percentage.
As you guys look at some of these results on the screen, I'm going to tell you, we talked about the national races that are of interest, with the United States Senate tied at 50-50. And I don't know, Sarah, if you can bring back up that map of the U.S. Senate. We were just looking a moment ago.
That's okay.
There are a couple of seats that Democrats are hoping to flip in the Senate, and those would be in Pennsylvania, where Senator Patrick Toomey is retiring. You have Dr. Oz, obviously famous as a television celebrity doctor, running as a Republican against John Fetterman as the Democrat. When we talk about likelihood of winning, and you've got a lot of pollsters and pundits out there and people who are data aggregators, 538 is one of the ones that's best known. So I was keeping track of some of what they said going into today. In their final analysis, they said they see Dr. Oz having a 57% chance of winning that race. That doesn't mean he'd win 57-43. It means that's their odds that he would somehow pull out a squeaker of a win. In Wisconsin, 538 gives Senator Ron Johnson an 81% chance of defending his seat, and that has grown dramatically in just recent days. So that's one of those races that has shifted in just the last few days in favor of the incumbent. Obviously, that's one of those key races to watch nationally, and that's why there's been so much money poured into this campaign, not just locally, but from outside groups trying to influence that. Republicans have a few seats that they want to flip in the United States Senate, and one of those is in Georgia, where you have the former NFL star Herschel Walker running as a Republican, trying to unseat Raphael Warnock. 538 gives Herschel Walker a 63% chance of winning that race. In Nevada, you have Adam Lexalt, the Republican, trying to unseat Catherine Cortez Masto. That one's even in 538's numbers a complete toss-up. Gives the GOP candidate a 51% chance of winning, but that could just go anywhere. And then finally, you have in Arizona, Blake Masters trying to take out Mark Kelly, the Democrat. But that's one where 538 is saying Democrats have a 66% chance of holding on to that seat. Those are 5 of the closest races in the Senate right now. And the way that pollster is putting it out, they have Republicans taking 4 of them. If that's the case, then Republicans would take back control of the U.S. Senate. But again, these are prognostications. They're guesses. They're best guesses. And polls are notoriously at times inaccurate.
But there are reasons for those guesses, right? We know that the president's party tends to suffer during midterm elections. We know that there are state polls that show that a number of people in the state, more than half, are dissatisfied with the direction our state is going. And we know that there are issues that are causing challenges for people like inflation. So when you have people who are unhappy, that doesn't always spell well for the person who is in power, whether it be Tony Evers or Joe Biden in this case. So there's reasons people are making those educated guesses, but also the polls show that some of those races here in Wisconsin have tightened as well. Mandela Barnes was further ahead, and now that margin has gotten so small. But again, the reason these U.S. Senate races matter so much is because we have 50-50 split right now in the U.S. Senate, with Kamala Harris as that tiebreaker vote. And while it's not easy for the president to get massive legislation, sweeping legislation through, it is helpful to have that tiebreaker vote when it comes to things like nominees and investigations. So that's why we're talking about that. And that's why so many people are interested in Wisconsin, and the political ads have been intense for
It's
that
been
reason
quite a
as well.
barrage. I will say that if you really look at what the sort of various pollsters and pundits across the board, Real Clear Politics, Politico, New York Magazine, the Cook Political Report, some of the others who observe this and measure this kind of stuff, it seems like there's a general consensus that Republicans are going to take back control of the United States House of Representatives, but that the Senate is a legitimate toss-up. And one way or the other, if that's the case, then we're going to see a divided government, because Joe Biden, of course, is not up for re-election right now. He is going to remain the president. You're seeing some numbers on your screen right there as we're getting more results in. This is the margin that we expected to see in terms of being razor close. Right at the moment, with 12% of precincts reporting, you see incumbent Governor Tony Evers with a 1% lead over Tim Michels. And the very earliest numbers had Tony Evers at 70-something% because it was such a small sample size, right? So that is just rapidly closing in. And I have a feeling as the night goes on, we're going to see that really close race. And you can't read too much into early numbers as to what that means one way or the other. They're probably going to flip-flop depending on whose votes come in first. And that's really the key, is where they're coming from.
And I can tell you from covering those election night events, the crowd is watching. You know, we showed our reporters who are out in the field at those election night parties. They're watching these results. And even early on, they cheer.
They'll cheer like a football
or they
score,
quietly sip their drinks and wait to see what the next round of updates brings.
Although this year they don't cheer that much if they're watching a Packers game, unless they're Bears fans. That's a whole different story. All right, I think speaking of numbers, we do have some more from the U.S. Senate race.
Okay, so we have 11% reporting, with Mandela Barnes 56% ahead of Ron Johnson's 44%. So again, results are just kind of trickling in, just 11% so far, still a long way from being able to determine where these are going to end up.
So we're, what, 40 minutes in, 35 minutes into the polls closing, and we're getting, double-digit percentages in. I don't think we're going to have results digital headquarters. And you know what, this I don't know if you can go wide, the wide shot, Jeff, and show the whole thing. Yeah, so this table is usually just a conference table, and it becomes an ad hoc studio for our election coverage, and sometimes technical difficulties happen. That's what happened. We apparently got knocked off, and we're talking here for about 5 minutes with absolutely nobody listening to us. So you know, I don't know if you care to know what we had to say, but one thing, we did learn some new stuff.
We did learn some updates during
That's
that
interesting.
time from our newsroom.
Ben Handelman stopped by, Fox 6's news anchor Ben Handelman stopped by to tell us that on the east side, there's a polling place that has an hour-long line still. Polls have been closed for 45 minutes, and they still have a huge line. Of course, once you're in line, if you're in line by the time polls close, they have to let you vote. So apparently a huge line there. We talk about when are results going to come in. They haven't even voted yet.
Right.
They're still voting. So
and
that
we're hearing
could
some
be
other
time.
interesting information out of Wauwatosa as well, right?
Yeah, so Ann Jacobs, who's a member of the Wisconsin Elections Commission, has been tweeting. This is another one that Ben spotted, but was tweeting, and I want to read what she had to say. She said, timing of results in Wisconsin, a thread, and I'm going to read this off. Anyone who tells you they know when Wisconsin results will come in is not being truthful. Results might be early, 11 p.m. or midnight. Actually, that's not the one I was looking at. Here we go, where she says, they are now saying, well, I can't find the exact tweet.
You got it?
You found it?
Thank
Okay,
you,
we're going to put it. There
Sarah.
it is. That's the one. City of Milwaukee on top of things remains likely to finish between 11 p.m. and 12 a.m. Other central count locations will not be as timely. Look at Wauwatosa. They expect them to finish by 5 a.m. and Racine around midnight to 1 a.m. I don't think we're going to have results real early tonight.
Right. So this might be one of those situations because our elections are often decided by such razor thin margins. We might have a lot of people going to bed tonight not knowing what the outcome may
And
be.
realize that those Wauwatosa, which has turned to becoming, while it's a suburb, it has turned to lean more toward Democrats. We heard Mordecai talking about that. It has certainly turned more blue. Milwaukee, it's going to come in late. Racine going to come in at midnight or 1 a.m. When those votes come in, if everything else in the state is in and those are the last votes to come in, they're going to shift the numbers toward Tony Evers and Josh Call and some of the others. The question is, what will the margin be at that point, and would that be enough to overcome it?
All right, we have a tweet from our reporter, Cassidy Williams. This is her view of the Evers watch party, and she says with 29% of precincts reporting, Evers is leading Michaels with 53% of the vote. And having covered these events myself, and I was telling you earlier, Brian, maybe when we were off air, the room gets very excited with every little update when you're at these election night parties. So the crowd will cheer, they'll get very excited, even if it's just 1% or 3%.
So whether it's really statistically warranted or not, they're cheering it like a football game.
Exactly. It's like a sporting event. That's a really good reference for it. But then again, if your candidate is trailing, it gets a little awkward, it gets a little quiet, and people just kind of mumble to each other and wait for the next update to come around. So it's actually really interesting to be at these election night parties and watch the wave that the crowd might be riding throughout the night.
Well, I was thinking about when Mordecai was sitting here and he was talking about his prediction that he thinks it's going to be a red tsunami. If our stream is playing in one of these campaign headquarters, which we know it was during the primary, are they booing? Are they hissing? Are they cheering? Obviously, there's a lot riding on this, a lot of emotions throughout the night. And you see that. You've talked about when you've been somewhere, there was an expectation of a win and it goes south.
I have seen that happen. It's like the air coming out of a balloon. It starts out really energetic. Everybody's excited. And then by the end of the night, everybody is quite deflated. It's quite something to watch. But we have reporters at all these events, and I'm sure they'll be giving live updates at 9 p.m. on Fox 6 about what they're seeing the crowd's reactions as. Now, we have an update here. 33% of the vote in on the U.S. Senate race. Mandela Barnes is ahead with 52% to Ron Johnson's 48%. Don't know where these votes are coming from, but 33%. So we're following these numbers as they come in. But that's a much bigger number than we saw the last time. 33% is a higher percentage of votes.
Yeah.
So we'll see what we get over the next couple hours.
The early percentages are coming in quickly. I think we're going to hit a point where there's going to be a real slowdown. We're probably going to get up into the 50, 60%, maybe, who knows, maybe more than that range. And then I think things are going to grind to a halt for a while. But obviously there's a long way to go to know what this means. We are seeing the numbers come in. I think I would say rather quickly for as many votes as are out there, but it's really hard to say how long this is going to go. And when we see a tweet like that from Ann Jacobs, that this could go on till midnight, 1 a.m., or in Wauwatosa's case, 5 a.m., boy, I think we'll be going to bed before we know anything.
But obviously, there's so much interest from people all over the state and what the outcomes of these races are. We have the governor's race, we have the U.S. Senate race, Attorney General's race, and these races all have implications. Even the Secretary of State race has implications on the direction our state will head in issues like how our elections are run, and who has the power in the U.S. Senate, and who has the power in the Assembly in Wisconsin and the state Senate. It all has impacts on whether the Republican agenda can go forward in this state. We've talked a lot tonight about the supermajority. If Republicans can get 2/3 of the House or the Assembly and the state Senate, they could have that supermajority and override an Evers veto. If he remains in his position, we could see Tim Michels get that job, and then the supermajority is essentially
A moot point, right?
Right. So there's so many different balls in
And
the
what
air.
happens with that really has a lot to do with this isn't just, this isn't just a football game. This isn't just wins and losses in a game. There are real implications of what that could mean. We've talked about just things like the future of what Wisconsin elections could look like. If Tim Michels wins, he's talked about getting rid of the Wisconsin Elections Commission altogether and moving some of those powers into the Secretary of State's office potentially. There are all sorts of implications of this. What could happen with Wisconsin's current 1849 abortion ban? Who wins the Attorney General's race could have a lot to do with how that is handled going forward. So there's a lot at stake in this, and we're going to find out the answers as to who has the power over those things in just, hopefully the next several hours. Maybe it's going to be longer. I guess we'll see.
And we know voters care about issues like inflation that could be driving people to the polls today, public schools, crime, gun violence, accurate vote count like we just discussed, abortion. Depending on what party you align with or whether you don't, a number of issues could be driving you to show up today. And it sounds like they are in places like Milwaukee. They said on Kane Street, I believe it is, where there is a line.
East side.
Yes, a long line. But again, we've been hearing anecdotal reports all day long about long lines in different communities. So it seems people were motivated, and predictions that people would turn out seem to be justified so far.
I guess it's better if there's going to be an hour-long wait at 9 o'clock at night, that at least it's as seasonably nice as it is outside right now.
It could be snowing right now.
Yeah, as opposed to being 15
raining.
degrees and windy. In fact, I'd say in just a few days, you wouldn't want to be out there this weekend. I think we're talking wind chills in the teens here in Wisconsin. So at least it's not so bad if you're standing outside tonight. But it does sound like a long wait, at least at that one east side location. After the polls have closed, people who are already in line still waiting to vote. So much less waiting to be counted, they're waiting to vote.
So if you're wanting updates on the U.S. Senate race or the governor's race, you can always go to fox6now.com. We also have different state races listed there, local races,
Sarah,
referendums.
Can you bring up the website again with the balance of power maps? Because this is what Jenna is telling you about.
Right. So you can see different states and how those House seats are being, they're coming in. Looks like we have 47 for the Democrats, 83 for the Republicans so far. That's okay. We hit refresh. But there's a number of different ways you can explore our website and see not just what's happening in Wisconsin, but also what's happening in other states, because there have been some very big high profile races in other states that have drawn a lot of attention. We mentioned Georgia earlier. So there's a number of interesting races out there, and they all have impacts. I mean, people always feel like this is the most important election is the one we're in, but this one feels awfully important depending
It's
on
the
what
most
side of the aisle
important
you are.
election today. We know that much, and there's a lot that is important.
We have another update from Ann.
Okay, so Ann Jacobs, update number 2. I am told Wauwatosa added staff and is now estimating a 12 a.m. finish time. Well, that's quite different from 5 a.m.
That
So
is more in line with some of the other communities we're hearing about. Milwaukee still shooting for between 11 p.m. and midnight. Racine talking about possibly around midnight to 1 a.m. That at least sounds like we could get some news before we go to bed if you're willing to stay up a little bit late and find out if these races are as important to many voters, or to many of you as it seems it has been to voters who showed up. Then you may want to stay up and find out the results. We may know something, but it still could be a few hours before we know.
Right, and we will take speeches if there are any speeches. We'll take some of those live on Fox 6 as well, and then I'm sure we'll be updating results all night long. If you wake up in the middle of the night, you can go check out our website and see what's coming in. Oh, it sounds like we're in the final 5 minutes.
Yeah, because
of our
in
broadcast
5
here.
minutes, we're going to want you, if you've got the ability to watch, you want to watch online, we're going to be going to the broadcast to the main studio. They're going to be taking over from there. We'll still be bringing you more updates, but we want you to be watching. Check out fox6now.com, the Fox 6 News Milwaukee YouTube channel, Fox 6 Milwaukee Facebook page. here we are getting some more results. We now have
Looks like
37%
So a
reporting.
little 4% more than last time, I think. So Mandela Barnes still has a lead with these votes reporting 52% to Ron Johnson's 48%. So results continuing to trickle in. Be interesting to see what we have in the next couple of hours.
Anything new? Do we have any new numbers for the governor's race yet? Or are we still
Did we get that as well?
take a look and see where we are? So we see Mandela Barnes with a 4% lead.
Let's see if that
37%
lines up
of the
with
precincts
the political
reporting.
parties
Last
of the
we saw,
governor.
I think we had Governor Evers had about a 1-point lead. Right now, it's showing him with a 7-point lead, with 38% of precincts reporting. 550,000 votes for Governor Evers to Tim Michaels, 468,000 votes. And the
Okay.
question is always, where are those votes coming from?
Yes.
What does that signal? Because we know, depending on what part of the state you're talking about, it can sway things dramatically. Obviously, in the rural parts of the state, Tim Michaels expected to dominate in Milwaukee and Dane counties. Governor
Mhm.
Evers expected to dominate the suburbs. An interesting question. Obviously, the WOW counties for a long time have been heavily Republican, but we've seen some shift in certain areas to
Mhm.
shrinking that gap. And to what degree that happens could have an impact on the outcome of this race.
Right. So we've talked about so many things here tonight. We talked about the record amount of campaign spending in the governor's race and the U.S. Senate race. I'm sure you're all going to be relieved to not have quite so many mailers in your mailbox every day, or to see so many commercials on TV or on the radio.
You know, when I was in here covering the Brooks trial in the Wake Up studio every morning, it was just nonstop commercial,
Mhm.
campaign commercials. I started to say them in my sleep because you just hear them all the time. I'm sure you've had that same experience. A lot of money's been spent on these races.
Absolutely. They were saying the U.S. Senate race was the 4th or 5th highest in terms of money spent in the country, and this is a record-setting race for the governor. $115 million were spent on campaign ads as of last week. That's not even counting dark money, which you've reported on. So that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, that's just the money we know about,
That's
right?
the money we know about.
So we're down to the final few minutes. I want to go back to one shot again of our setup here. And again, thank photojournalist Jeff Frings for putting together this whole setup. On the to his right, you have, and she can wave, executive producer Sarah Smith, and behind her, Anthony Mandela. No
Always
relation
trying to
whatsoever
hide,
to
Anthony.
Mandela Barnes.
We still see you.
But this is an ad hoc setup because and probably by tomorrow, this will just be a conference table again. But this is our digital headquarters for elections, and it will be, I'm sure, for future elections to come. But when we go away here in a couple of minutes, you can watch live coverage at fox6now.com from our Fox 6 main studios.
And we have all those reporters who are live in the field. So if you want to see what it's like at the Mandela Barnes party at the Ron Johnson, we have someone with Michaels, we have someone at Evers. We're all over the place. Ashley Sears is at Central Count, so you can check in with whether there's a flurry of activity over there. And that's one of my favorite parts, is seeing the reporters who are out at these events. Because earlier when we checked in with them, it was pretty calm there. People were just starting to arrive. There was more media than bodies of who were supporters of these different people. So that's always my favorite part.
We have the ATV referendum.
Oh, gosh.
Oh, you
the
finally got it in. We were
ATV
able to get it in. The Town of Randall ATV referendum, Jason Calby's favorite issue so far with, what is that? Oh, that's 100% in.
100% reporting.
ATVs are going to be on the road in the Town of Randall.
Well, now we know Randall's votes are included in
That was a
those
nearly
total.
2-to-1. They want their ATVs on the road. So there you go. We were able to get that one in. Sarah was smiling. She really wanted to get that one in before we were done.
Oh, my
Jenna and
goodness.
I, it's funny. I think back to the mayor's race back in the spring election, and we were hearing the victory speech before we went off and tossed things to the 9 o'clock show. Here, we're nowhere close to knowing the results. And I think we expected that as a general election with huge turnout. It's going to be a little while.
I think people were prepared for this to be a long night. I heard that on the radio. I heard that on TV. Everybody was predicting this would be a late night. I hope we have some indication before we go to bed tonight, but that's not necessarily guaranteed.
Yeah, Jenna and I are going to be going away from this little space, but I don't think I'm leaving the station anytime soon. We're going to be watching these results. And of course, Fox 6 News is going nowhere. We're going to be here throughout the night, bringing these results to you both on air and online. So don't forget to check fox6now.com. That's where you can see the results. You can see those interactive maps showing you the balance of power in Congress, the balance of power in the state legislature. You can hear from our reporters who are out live in the field. And before the night is over, hopefully we'll know who's going to be the next governor of the state of Wisconsin, the next U.S. senator, and so on and so forth. But that's what we have for now tonight. Jenna, it's been great. Your voice hung in there for the last.
It did. I lost
couple of
my
hours.
voice and it came back, and we didn't know how this was going to go. So that's one victory for us.
All right. Well, thanks everybody, and we'll